Hey guys, welcome to Code Tech Talk. My name is Carlos Cucalon, and today we're going to talk about CSS variables, how to use it, how to set it up and use it within your brand, and different elements and how it is applicable for not only you, but for other members within your team, and how this actually helps you guys as you're developing the brand for your company or your website. So what we're going to do is the first thing is that we're going to set up our CSS variables. In order to set up a CSS variables, we're going to use the root selectors. You can see it's going to be the colon root, and then it's just going to be like any other CSS selectors. You can see that I already have some selection or some variables set up in here. We're going to talk a little bit about them in just a minute. I forgot to mention, we do have the GitHub files. They're going to be in the description below. So please feel free to go look at the description, click on that. And I'm going to have a couple more resources in there so that you can read up a little bit more about how to select colors, different tools that you can use to select colors as well for your website. And so let's dive into this. In order to create a variable, the way that you actually set it up in CSS is using two dashes and then the name of your variable, something like variable in our case here. And then you can actually set up a colon and then a space, and then you can set up whatever variable you want to set up, maybe like the color green or something like that. Now, this variable here can now be used within our site, within our CSS. So for example, if I were to go to the body tag here, and I were to use something like, for example, background color, and set up my color as green, instead of having to type in green here, right? And I save it. Instead of doing that, I can use it as a variable. So the way that you call a variable is using the var word, and then an open parenthesis, close parenthesis, and inside of the parenthesis, you're going to do the two dashes variable, if I can type, and then the semicolon at the end, and you can see that it has the same outcome. Now, you may be wondering, why am I doing this? Well, what if you have several elements that have the same variable name? Maybe you want to change them all at once. Maybe instead of green, we can change it to blue. Now, anything that has that blue variable, right, then it's going to change, or that variable is going to change throughout your whole site. So as you can see, there might be times when you're working with a team and you guys are selecting a specific color. It can be hard to maybe keep track of all the different colors that you're using. But if one of you guys is in charge of actually working, or maybe using, if you're working by yourself, if you're working, you can set up your colors and your palette so that when you go into actually the design of the website, then you know, okay, if I want to use this color, I can call it as a primary color, secondary color, tertiary color. Maybe I want to use a black, maybe that is not completely black, like 000, maybe it's a 111, like a super dark gray, or maybe I want a dark gray that is maybe 444, or maybe a 333, something along the lines of that, using hexadecimal colors. So that's the purpose of using variables. Variables allow you to set it in one place and use it throughout the site without having to going back over and over and over again to try to set up these colors, or try to remember what the hexadecimal color, or if something changes, say your brand color changes from this blue to maybe something like a dark blue, then you don't have to change it in multiple places. You can only change it in one place, and then it cascades down to the rest of the CSS. This is really great. It's an addition to what CSS does now. So I would highly suggest for you to use it. In our case, I already did a little bit of legwork for you guys. So I set up this page. This page contains kind of a header section, a footer section. Inside of it, I also set up several colors. So I set up a primary color, primary dark, primary light, secondary dark, secondary light. You can see that in the page. Hopefully you guys are seeing alongside as I'm working on this. I also set up some typography. Again, this is my typography. You don't have to use it. But again, it's just kind of like a baseline for all of us to have the same files. We're working together on this. If you want to change it, again, you have this information now. I also have a grid system, which is not relatable to anything here that we're going to talk about today, except that my grid system that I created actually uses, variables to be able to create the different columns between column 1, 2, 3, 4, and then I'm using variables inside of variables, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit. So I also created some buttons for us to be able to use as we're working on the site and setting up some styles, and I think that's it. So let me show you a couple of resources that I use as I'm usually selecting colors. Depending on the colors that I'm working with, I use two different sites. So I use something called colorbox.io. In here, it actually shows me and it allows you to select kind of your colors. So for example, you can select your hue, which will be the actual color itself. You can set up the different variables, values in there, maybe one color to the next, and it kind of shows you the scaling from one to the next. Maybe the saturation, maybe I don't want them too dark, I want it a little bit lighter, it's whatever it may be. So I have a range here that I can select, and it sets up some steps for me. I also have the brightness, which again can make it very bright, very, very dark, and I can choose anything in between. And if I wanted to lock a specific color, then I'm able to set it up here as well. I'll have a really good read that I found on medium.com that talks about colors and how to set it up and how this website came about. I also use another website called color.adobe.com, and this one is great as when you select, for example, a specific color that you're working with, your base color, you can set up different type of color schemes like analogous, monochromatic, triad, complementary, and you can see all these different colors and how they work. Maybe you want to use shades, maybe you want something darker, something lighter. Maybe you can even customize the way that this works. But so again, this is very, very, very nice, specifically if you already know kind of what the color palettes are going to be. In our case here, because I'm just going to use random colors, you'll see how we're going to use colorbox.io for our example today. If you look at our index.html, you will also see that I created a list of colors, and each one of these has a class of primary, primary dark, primary light. And just to keep it simple, we're going to use the same types of names as we're creating our variables. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to set up our variables. We're going to set up the first one, primary color, semicolon, primary dark, semicolon, primary light, semicolon, secondary color. Same thing, we're going to do that for secondary dark and secondary light. Then we're going to do tertiary. For this one, I'm not going to do dark or light. I'm also going to create maybe dark gray that I can use, maybe a light gray, maybe I want something shaded or a box to be kind of highlighted in the background, I can use that. Maybe I can use something, maybe something needs to be highlighted black. And then maybe I can use something for white. Now, a lot of these colors look very similar, like, okay, well, black can be just 0, 0, 0, but what if that changes? What if you want that black to be something like maybe 1, 1, 1, or instead of the white being just a completely white, F, 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 or just white, you want something like a shade of white, like, for example, an FA, 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 or which will be a little bit of a light gray, but again, maybe there needs to be a distinction between those two colors. And then I'm going to use also another class, another variable, I'm sorry, for my text, and I'm just going to call it text in my case. So for my primary color, using colorbox.io, I'm just going to pick something here, like, for example, maybe my primary color can be this fuchsia here, and I'm going to set that up. Maybe if I want it dark, I'm going to go a shade darker. If I want it lighter, I'm going to go a shade lighter. Then maybe my secondary color can be these, maybe this dark blue. So we have this dark blue here. Or let's use this one instead so that I can go one up, one down. If I want it darker, maybe I can set this up here. If I want it lighter, I can use kind of this purple here. My tertiary color, I'm going to use this blue, light blue towards the end as well. Maybe my dark gray is going to be something like 666, 666. My light gray, let's go ahead and do something like FA, FA, FA. Maybe my black, I can just set it up as black or 000. One more zero. My white, I'm just going to set it up as pure white, which is the Fs. And then my text, here's something interesting. You can use variables inside of variables. So for example, if I didn't want to change my text color, I could use something like maybe 444 here, right? But say in the future, I changed that dark gray to say 444, or maybe I wanted that dark gray to be 444, and I wanted my text to reflect the same color as the dark gray. I can use a variable inside of this variable and call it dark gray. And for example, if you look at the site now, we should have these boxes with all the different colors that we picked. And then if you look at this dark gray and these tags are the same. And again, if I were to change that to say 222, 222, then you see how these change colors. And now everything else kind of change colors as well. If you'll actually notice that I set up my H1 have a color of primary dark. If I wanted to use something different, I could use something different as well. Maybe I don't want the primary dark, I want the secondary dark to be the one that becomes my color for my headings. Same thing for H2, H3s. And you'll see here, that's why I have these heading references between H1, H2, H3. So you can see how the colors intermingle with each other. Again, if you're using your own CSS, feel free to change over whatever I have here within my my typography up here at the top, so that you can see how it would interact, or you can copy even the variables that we created and then just apply them to your own typography as well. So you can see how they kind of work with each other and seeing how they interact with each other. You'll see, for example, that I also, for my bold right here, or strong, I actually used the black color as well, which is darker than the dark gray that we have here. So I have another way that I can select that. I have this light gray here that I could use. So again, these are just different options that you have as far as, different colors. You don't have to use as many colors as these. For me, I have found that I use most of these colors in one way or another, as far as primary, dark, light, secondary, dark, light, tertiary, and then text, black, white, dark gray, and light gray, in case maybe I need the difference between these two, between darks and then maybe the white and the light gray. Maybe I need for something else to change. I don't know. So I have those, and I usually use all of these colors as I'm working on a website. Again, I have this typography here set up as a reference so you can see it. And so let's go ahead and do the following. This is a good exercise so you can see how things actually scale down and help as far as color changes and palettes are set up. So let's go ahead and create these buttons, and we're going to use these buttons to add some sort of element for actions, call to actions for our website. So what we're going to do is let's go ahead and set up these buttons here. And if you go back to the HTML, or even here on the page itself, I actually created the markup that you would take to be able to use these buttons here. So let's go ahead and do that. So the first button that we're going to create is going to be the BTN class. The second one is going to be the BTN primary, and then BTN secondary, and BTN tertiary. And let's go ahead and, just to be 100%, make sure that we're using it only anytime that we use these buttons. Let's go ahead and we're going to make sure that we have this button declaration alongside with our BTN primary. The reason why I have two different classes to distinguish them is because most of these will have the same styles. So you want to make sure that you're using the same styles for the buttons and whatnot from one button to the next. So what we're going to do here is in our button primary, what we're going to do is let's go ahead and set up our display just to make sure that it actually creates it as a button. So we're going to do display inline block. Okay. And then the next thing that we're going to do is overflow hidden. This kind of makes it look like a button and behave like a button. One of the things that you'll find is that because I have these link declarations up here, as you can see here on my CSS, these link declarations, I'm declaring the pseudo selectors as well as link, active, hover, visited. We're going to have to do the same for our buttons to make sure that they all work the same and work as intended. So let's go ahead and add these pseudo selectors as well. So we're going to use the link, active, hover, and visited within our CSS selector here. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to add some padding. And for my padding, usually what I do is that I calculate, right, the font size of my button, and then I divide it by the line height, which in my case is going to be 1.618. And then that's going to be for my primary value, and my secondary value, I usually use it as a 1em, for example. And you can see kind of that the buttons switch over in size. We're not able to see it just yet because we haven't added a background color. I don't need all these parentheses. I don't know why I did that. So let me go ahead and get rid of these parentheses here. Now, one of the things that I found as I'm working with different developers and as we're doing projects with them is that sometimes there's inconsistency as far as sizings and things that we do as in the website. So for example, you'll see that for me, because I'm only working by myself on this project, right? I'm using the same calculation down here in my padding for my table header and table cell. What I can do, instead of having other people try to figure that out or remember if I were to pass this along, is I could create another variable up here, right? That can be more of a layout variable. And we can go ahead and maybe call it something like, I don't know, let's go ahead and call it just padding. And then inside of that, we can do this variable here called calc1em and do this. So when we go to our CSS, for our buttons, instead of having to have this whole declaration here and having to repeat it, we can just go ahead and call that same padding for the buttons. And then, of course, we're going to fix our table where we remove the padding here. And then we're going to use the same padding. Again, when you do this, it helps with the consistency from one to the next element. So if at any point we need, for example, our left side to have a little bit more padding throughout the whole site, then we can change it in one place and then it updates everywhere else. Again, anytime that you do anything within a computer, be CSS, JavaScript, backend coding like C#, Java, whatever it may be, think about developers are very smart people that try to do things in simple ways. And setting up a variable, especially now in CSS, is one of those ways that can make it very, very, very simple for you to pass one thing and make it change throughout the whole site. So let's go ahead and continue working on our buttons. Now that we've done that, let's go ahead and go into our buttons. And now let's go ahead and just give it a background color so that we can see what we're doing. Background color, and let's go ahead and use our light gray. All right, and you may or may not be able to see it within the screen resolution here, but it's there. Let's go ahead and maybe change our dark gray to light gray to something else that is a little bit more visible, like EF, EF, EF. And now you can see that a little bit better. All right, and the next thing that we're going to do is remove that text decoration to say, for example, none, so we don't want it to have any colors. And for right now, let's just go ahead and change that color into something like black. We want that just so that we can see it, right? And then that's it. So that's what we're doing here as far as our button. So we created our button. Take a look at the difference between inline block and block. If we were to do block, you can see that the buttons extend themselves all the way as far as the element allows it to. When you do inline block, it actually allows it to extend only up to where the content of the button requires it to extend to. So that's why we're using inline block instead of block. If the reason why we're using overflow hidden is because when we do that, it extends the content all the way to the border of the button itself. So if it is mixed up with other elements, then it holds its own space. If not, then you might see some cropping of maybe jumping into the line above it or the line below, whatever it may be. So let's go ahead and now style our primary button. In our primary button, we're going to do the same thing. So we're going to add our link, our active, and our hover as well, and visit it as well. So let's go ahead and do that real quick. And then, because I don't like to type that much, we're going to do that a couple times, and we're just going to copy paste these things. We're going to do the same thing for tertiary. Again, we're trying to be as thorough as we can as we're doing our CSS selectors here. So we have that. So for example, for our primary button, we can do our primary color. So background color. And then we can set up our variable or call our variable called primary color. Now, all of our buttons now change that color. And maybe we can change that instead of using black on our BTN, we can use something like white. Or if we wanted to, we could also change it within our BTN primary link as well. So now let's go ahead and say for our secondary color, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to change our background color. And let's go ahead and do something like secondary. And now we have our secondary color here. And you'll notice that because we don't have any hover effect on it, there's nothing, we haven't called anything for hover. When we hover, it's still going to be the primary color, and we're going to fix that in just a little bit. Now for our tertiary, I like to do something different for our for tertiary buttons, mainly because I want those to, they serve the purpose of, like, for example, the read more button, or maybe click here to find more information, things like that. I don't really use tertiary buttons. I usually try to stick to two main colors as far as actions. For other kind of things and links that I usually use the tertiary button. Again, for more of those like read here or read more, or whatever it may be. So for the tertiary link, what I usually want to do, I usually zero out the padding so that it doesn't have any padding. I also remove the background color, so I call it transparent. And then what I do is I actually set up the color for that font as the variable. So tertiary color. And now that looks more like what I would use on a tertiary button as well. Okay. Now the next thing that I am going to do here is that I'm going to create those hover effects. So here we go, and we're going to use this hover. Just copy that from primary, and then we're going to do the same thing for secondary, and then we're going to do the same thing for tertiary. Again, copy and paste is my best friend. Secondary as well. Perfect. So now what I'm going to do is, for example, for my primary, I can use background color, VAR, primary dark, for example. And when I save it, now you can see that now these switches over. Same thing here. We're going to do, say, for background color, right here, secondary, and we're going to call it secondary dark. You see that now that when I go here, it changes color. For my tertiary, what I do is I usually do something like font weight, and then I use either 800 or 600 or bold, or whichever one I feel that will be more useful in that situation. 600 is usually bold, 800 is bolder. So those are the options that I like to do. So here's something else that we can do. Now, if you notice as we're working on these buttons, when you hover over, it has that really immediate transition between one color and the next. You can see that how you hover over and it immediately changes back. One thing that we can also do with variables is set up, for example, rules on how we can use transitions. So if you didn't know, CSS have ways to transition from one state to another. And in our case, what we're going to do is we're going to transition anytime that the background color changes in these buttons for it to maybe take a little bit of a delay and use maybe a transition specific, transition delay, like for example, ease anytime that we're doing this. So what we're going to do, again, we can set up another CSS variable. So let's go ahead and call it something like global transition time, because I want it to be, say, for example, 0.5 seconds, right? And then let's go ahead and say, for example, the delay type that I wanted to use, global transition delay. I can go ahead and use something like ease, and then global say for example, I want it for the whole combined thing, maybe global BG transition. And then here I can call it something like use the background color as far as my selector for the transition, and then use my variables that are already declared. So for example, I can set up my time. Instead of setting up as 0.5 seconds, I can go ahead and set it up as global transition time. And then I can set up the other one, right, the delay, to as global transition delay. I'll also go ahead and place a link in the footer or in the description of this video as well, so that you can see all the different transitions and how you can use it in CSS. If you'd like for me to create a video on how to use transitions and the most used transitions on that I usually use, then let me know in the comments below, and I should be able to do that as well. So here I can use this global transition here. And for example, when we go to our button right here, then we can go ahead and use the property called transition. And as our value, we can actually call it var and use this transition. So now that I saved it, when I hover over, let's see, global transition. Let me see. Did I misspell something? Let's take a look in here. Background color. I am using background color. See, I'm checking right now. What I'm doing is I'm checking that I'm using the proper property here in CSS to make sure that those are happening there. All right. So let's go ahead and make sure that I typed these properly. Okay. Time, transition delay. Oh, see what I did? I have misspelled it. So that's why that wasn't working. All right. Now that we fixed my dumb mistake, now you can see that anytime that I hover over the buttons, now they are actually taking place and the transition kind of happens very smoothly. Now, that's a little 0.5 seconds. It takes too long for my taste. So I'm going to change the transition time to say like 0.25. And again, the benefit is like, for example, if I had to have other transitions within the site, I can have them all using this global transition time so that they all kind of feel and behave the same way from one thing to the next. So now that we're done that, now we have this transition button, our button here, tertiary button. Let's go ahead and add something else on our tertiary button just so that it looks a little bit nicer, especially if I'm going to use it for something like read more. You usually see something similar to this. We're going to select our BTN tertiary class selector, and then we're going to use the pseudo selector called after, and we're just going to go ahead and add content to this to the page, and we're just going to add these greater than sign. And let's go ahead and also add maybe a little bit of padding to the left, 0.5 EM. And that way it has a little bit of more space between the button and the greater than sign. If you want to use something different, then feel free to do that as well. But again, these are just recommendations. This is kind of what I do so that I can have a visual of how my site is going to look like, right? And how it's all going to relate to each other. Now, the next thing that we're going to do is we're just going to create, use this BTM, class modifiers. So I created two different class modifiers. One that is BTN small, which will make this button a little bit smaller, and then BTN large, which is going to make this button a little bit larger in case you need to have those as well as reference and for reference for you. So let's go ahead and do that. And these are going to be very, very simple. So let's go ahead and do BTN. And then we're going to do the class of BTN small. And then BTN large, okay? Now, maybe we can go ahead and do the following. We can do font size 0.8 EM, save that, and you can see how the button changed. And then font size 1.25 EM, and save that, and you see how the font size itself changed. But maybe I want to be able to use these font sizes for something else. Again, if I think that I'm going to use them for something else, or maybe later on as I'm working, I find that I am using it for more than just one thing, I usually store these values up to the top in my variables so that I can reuse them throughout the site. So for example, I have these font size declarations as well. So let me go ahead and maybe use something like SM font, and then let's do 0.8 EM, and then large font, and then use the 1.25, or you know what, let's use the same font size as our line highlight, 1.618 EM. So now I have these set up as variables, and now I can use them here. So if I go to my buttons, let's go ahead and use our variable as small font, save that, and you should see a change on this one, bar, large font, and then save that, and now you see this variable change. Now you might be asking yourself, well, did the padding change? And the answer is yes. You can see very clearly how this padding is way smaller than this padding right here, and this padding size is way smaller than, for example, this one back here, but also this one in the middle, which is a normal one. The reason why that works is because we are using responsive sizes within our CSS. So if you notice, we're using EMs, which actually takes the value or the font size based on the element that you're working with. So because it's using this 1.618 EM for the large font size, the padding multiplies that against this value versus just say like 1 EM. Now, again, I like to use as much as I can use as far as responsive sizes, because check this out. See what happens if I were to change all my font sizes, my base font size, instead of just 1 EM to say 1.25 EMs, then everything in my site grows, gets bigger, my font sizes gets bigger, the paddings get bigger, everything is responsive based on the size that I'm using. So this is one of the ways that you can use CSS variables so that you can use it throughout the site. And in that way, you can actually maybe use and standardize the way that your site looks, or how other people use it. Use the branding colors, use maybe the colors, the font families, the font sizes, all these things. You have a way to standardize it so that if somebody sets it, somebody else can use it without any problems. So I would suggest, please go to GitHub, download this file, test it out, and let me know if you have questions, comments, concerns, and I should be able to help answer them in the comments below, or maybe create a different file, maybe help you. If you want to connect with me, just leave me a comment and maybe we can meet up either Zoom or whatever it may be. Hope to talk to you guys soon. Cheers.